The rain came down like bullets that October evening in 1947. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the storm tear through her small Montana farm. The wind howled so loud she could barely hear herself think. She'd been through plenty of storms before, but something about this one felt different, meaner somehow. She was just about to turn away from the window when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Her horses were making noise in the barn, not the usual restless sounds they made during bad weather. This was different. This was panic. Margaret grabbed her oil lantern and the old wool coat that had belonged to her late husband. The coat still smelled like him even after 2 years. She wrapped it tight around herself and pushed open the kitchen door. The wind nearly knocked her backward. The walk to the barn felt like a mile, though it was barely 50 yards. Rain soaked through her coat in seconds. Mud sucked at her boots with every step. The lantern swung wildly in her hand, throwing crazy shadows across the yard. When she finally reached the barn door, she had to put her whole weight against it to slide it open. That's when she saw him. A man lay crumpled near the entrance, half in the mud, half on the dry barn floor. His horse stood over him, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with fear. The animal was barely holding it together. Margaret's first instinct was to run. A strange man on her property, in the middle of nowhere with no neighbors for miles. Every sensible bone in her body screamed danger. But then she saw the blood. It ran down the side of his face, mixing with the rain. His hat had fallen off, revealing gray hair matted dark and wet. He wasn't moving. For a terrible moment, she thought he might be dead. She stood there frozen, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The lantern shook in her hand. What should she do? Go back to the house and pretend she never saw him? Ride into town for the sheriff? That would take hours in this weather. Then the man groaned. The sound broke through her fear. He was hurt, badly hurt, and whether she liked it or not, she couldn't just leave a wounded man in her barn to die. Margaret set down the lantern and approached carefully. Up close, she could see he was older, probably 60, maybe more. His clothes were good quality, the kind a successful rancher might wear. His boots were expensive leather, worn but well-maintained. "Mister," she called out.
"Can you hear me?"
No response. Just another low groan. She knelt beside him, trying to remember everything her mother had taught her about tending wounds. The gash on his head was ugly, but head wounds always bled worse than they were. At least that's what she told herself. First, she needed to get him out of the doorway. Margaret wasn't a large woman, but years of farm work had made her strong. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was heavier than he looked. Inch by inch, she dragged him deeper into the barn, to where the hay was dry and clean. The stranger's horse followed, calmer now that someone was helping. Margaret recognized the animal was well-trained, expensive. This wasn't some drifter. This was somebody. She ran back to the house, moving faster than she thought possible. Her mind raced through what she needed. Clean cloth, water, whiskey for cleaning the wound, blankets. How did this happen? What was she doing? What if he died right there in her barn? Back in the barn, she worked by lantern light. Her hands shook as she cleaned the wound as best she could. The gash ran along his temple, probably from hitting something hard. A rock? A fence post? In this storm, it could have been anything. She pressed clean cloth against the cut until the bleeding slowed. Then she wrapped his head with strips torn from an old sheet. It wasn't pretty, but it would do until she could get him to a doctor, if he made it until morning. Margaret covered him with every blanket she could spare, then sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. What now? She couldn't leave him alone. What if he stopped breathing? What if the bleeding started again? She dragged an old chair close to where he lay and settled in to wait. The storm raged outside. Inside the barn, it was quieter. She could hear the horses settling down, the rain drumming on the roof, and the strangers breathing. Rough but steady. Time moved strangely that night. Sometimes she'd look at her watch and only 5 minutes had passed when it felt like an hour. Other times she'd jolt awake realizing she'd dozed off, panicked that something had gone wrong. But the man kept breathing. In and out. In and out. Around midnight, he started muttering. Nothing she could understand, just fragments of words. Names maybe, places. She wondered who he was. Did he have family looking for him? A wife waiting somewhere worried sick? Margaret thought about her own husband, Tom. How he'd died so suddenly. The pneumonia taking him in less than a week. How she'd sat by his bed just like this, helpless, watching him slip away. She'd been alone ever since. Just her and this struggling farm and debt piling up higher every month. The bank wanted her land. They'd made that clear enough. One more missed payment and they'd take everything Tom had worked for. Everything they'd built together. She looked at the stranger lying in her hay. Here was someone else's problem, someone else's tragedy, and she'd taken it on without thinking. Maybe that made her foolish. Maybe it made her kind. She honestly didn't know anymore. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind died down to a whisper. The rain softened to a steady patter. Margaret's eyes grew heavy. She tried to fight it, but exhaustion won. Her chin dropped to her chest and sleep pulled her under. She woke to birdsong and morning light streaming through the barn walls. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then everything came rushing back. The stranger. Margaret jumped up from her chair, her body stiff and aching. She looked down at where the man had been lying. His eyes were open. Clear blue eyes that watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not fear, not confusion. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, though they'd never met before. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Seems I owe you my life." Margaret stood there, words stuck in her throat. She had no idea that this moment, this simple act of helping a stranger, was about to change everything. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, she'd be holding papers that would transform her entire world. All she knew was that a wounded man lay in her barn, and she'd done what any decent person would do. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes, simple kindness is worth more than gold. Margaret didn't know what to say. The stranger was awake, looking at her with those clear blue eyes, and she suddenly felt embarrassed. Her hair was a mess. Her clothes were still damp from the storm. She probably looked like something the cat dragged in. You were hurt," she finally managed. "I couldn't just leave you there." The man tried to sit up, winced, and thought better of it. Most people would have. Woman alone, strange man on her property in the middle of the night. You took a real risk. Are you feeling all right? That's a nasty cut on your head. He reached up carefully and touched the bandage she'd wrapped around his temple. I've had worse, though I have to admit I can't remember much after my horse threw me. Name's William. William Thornton. Most folks call me Bill. Margaret Hayes, this is my farm. Well, what's left of it anyway. She hadn't meant to add that last part. It just slipped out. Bill's eyes moved around the barn, taking in details. She saw him notice the broken boards she'd been meaning to fix for months. The old equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The thin layer of hay that spoke of stretching supplies. How long have you been running this place alone? He asked. The question caught her off guard. How did you... The coat you're wearing. It's a man's coat, but it's been a while since a man wore it regular, and there's a kind of tired in your eyes that comes from caring too much by yourself. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back angrily. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Crying didn't fix fences or pay bills. 2 years, she said. My husband Tom passed from pneumonia. Left me the farm and more debt than I knew existed. Bill nodded slowly, like he understood more than she was saying. I'm sorry for your loss. Pneumonia took my wife too, 5 years back. Some kinds of grief don't ever really leave, do they? Something about the way he said it made Margaret's throat tight. Here was someone who understood. Not with empty words or awkward pats on the shoulder, but real understanding. Let me get you some breakfast, she said, needing to move, to do something. You must be starving. I don't want to be a burden. You already are, she said, but she smiled when she said it. Might as well feed you while you're here. She brought him eggs and bread, coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Bill ate slowly, and she noticed his hands shook slightly. He was hurt worse than he was letting on. You need a doctor, she said. I need to tell you what happened. And then I need to ask you a favor. Margaret sat down on a hay bale across from him. I'm listening. Bill set down his coffee cup and looked at her straight. I own a ranch about 30 miles north of here. 2,000 acres. Been building it for 40 years. Started with nothing but a dream and a lot of stubborn determination. 2,000 acres. Margaret tried to imagine it. Her 40 acres felt overwhelming most days. I was out checking some grazing land in the northern section yesterday when the storm hit. Horse got spooked by lightning, threw me into a fence post. I must have wandered for hours before I found your place. The rest you know. You need to get word to your family. They must be worried sick. Something dark crossed Bill's face. That's the thing. I don't have much in the way of family. My wife and I never had children. There's a nephew, my brother's boy, but... He trailed off. But what? Bill was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy. You ever watch something you built your whole life for slip away from you? Watch someone look at it and see only dollar signs? Margaret thought about the bank. The way they looked at her farm like it was already theirs. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. My nephew, Raymond, he's been after me to sell the ranch. Says I'm too old to run it anymore. Says we should sell to some development company out of Denver. They want to turn it into vacation homes for rich folks from the city. The bitterness in his voice was thick enough to taste. Over 40 years of work. 40 years of building something that matters. And he wants to sell it off piece by piece like it's nothing. Like it's just property instead of a life. Margaret understood. Land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was every sunrise you'd watched over it. Every drop of sweat you'd poured into it. Every dream you'd planted in its soil. So what are you going to do? She asked. That's what I've been thinking about all night. Well, the parts of the night I was conscious for. He gave her a small smile. I kept drifting in and out, but I'd open my eyes and see you there. Keeping watch. You didn't have to do that. Couldn't sleep anyway. Storm was too loud. Don't sell yourself short. You stayed because you're a good person. Because when you see someone who needs help, you help them. No questions asked. No thought of what you might get in return. Margaret felt uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Bill said firmly. They wouldn't have. I've known plenty of people in my 67 years. Most folks, they help when it's convenient. When it costs them nothing. You helped when it was risky. When you had every reason not to. Where is this going, Bill? He looked at her for a long moment. That favor I mentioned. I need you to drive me into town, to my lawyer's office. You really should see a doctor first, lawyer first, doctor after. There's something I need to take care of and it can't wait. Margaret wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. This wasn't a request born from a head injury or confusion. This was a man who'd made up his mind about something important. All right, she said, but we're stopping by the doctor's office after whether you like it or not. Deal. It took some doing to get Bill to his feet and out to her old truck. The vehicle had seen better days, just like everything else on her property. The engine coughed and sputtered before finally turning over. As they drove toward town, Bill looked out the window at the passing countryside. The storm had washed everything clean. The world looked new, full of possibility. You remind me of my wife, he said suddenly. Ruth. She had that same quiet strength. That same way of just doing what needed to be done without making a fuss about it. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She would have liked you, Bill continued. She always said you could tell everything about a person by how they treat animals and strangers. Says the two groups can't lie or pay you back, so if you're kind to them, it means you're kind for real. Sounds like she was a smart woman. The smartest. I've been lost without her, if I'm being honest. The ranch feels empty. The house feels empty. Some days I wake up and wonder what I'm even fighting for anymore. They drove in silence for a while. Margaret kept stealing glances at Bill, wondering what was going through his mind. What could be so important that he needed to see his lawyer before a doctor? When they finally pulled up in front of a small office on Main Street, Bill turned to her. What I'm about to do, he said, it's going to seem crazy. My lawyer's going to think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Margaret's stomach fluttered with nervousness. Bill, what are you talking about? He opened the truck door and stepped out slowly. Then he looked back at her with those clear blue eyes. Come inside with me. There's something I need to do, and I need you there to do it. Margaret turned off the engine and followed him into the office, her heart pounding. She had no idea that in the next hour, her entire life was about to change forever. Sometimes the biggest moments in life don't announce themselves. They just happen, quiet as morning light, changing everything. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and pipe tobacco. A secretary looked up from her typewriter as they walked in, her eyes widening at the sight of Bill's bandaged head. Mr. Thornton, good Lord, what happened to you? Just a little accident, Dorothy. Is Henry in? Yes, but he's with a client. Should I, tell him it's urgent, please? Something in Bill's tone made the secretary nod quickly and disappear through a heavy wooden door. Margaret stood awkwardly in the waiting area, feeling out of place. The office was nice. Really nice. The kind of place where important business happened. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s emerged, concern written all over his face. He was wearing a three-piece suit and had the kind of careful way of moving that lawyers have. Bill, What in God's name happened? We've been looking for you since yesterday. Your foreman called me at home last night. Said you never came back from checking the North Range. I'm fine, Henry. Had a fall, got turned around in the storm. This is Mrs. Hayes. She saved my life. Henry looked at Margaret properly for the first time, and she saw him taking in her worn dress and work-rough hands. She lifted her chin a bit higher. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Well, Mrs. Hayes, we're all in your debt. Please, both of you, come into my office. They settled into leather chairs that were more comfortable than anything Margaret had sat in for years. Henry poured coffee from a silver pot, his movements practiced and smooth. Now, Bill, what's this about? You said it was urgent. Bill set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. I want to deed my ranch to Mrs. Hayes, all 2,000 acres. The house, the cattle, everything. I want it done today. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry's face went pale. Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She couldn't have heard that right. She couldn't have. Bill, Henry said carefully. You hit your head. Maybe we should get you to a doctor first and then I'm thinking clearly, Henry. Clearer than I have in months. But this is insane. You're talking about your life's work. Everything you've built. You can't just give it away to a stranger. She's not a stranger. Not anymore. Margaret found her voice, though it came out shaky. Mr. Thornton, I can't. This is crazy. I don't know the first thing about running a ranch that size. I can barely keep my own farm going. You'll learn. And you'll have help. I've got good people working for me. They know what to do, but why? Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. Why would you do this? Bill turned to look at her, and his expression was so open, so honest, it made her chest ache. Last night when I was lying in that barn, I kept thinking about my wife, about what Ruth would want me to do with the ranch. And I realized something. She wouldn't want it to go to Raymond. She'd want it to go to someone who understood what it meant to fight for something. Someone who knew the value of the land, not just its price. You met me 12 hours ago. Sometimes 12 hours is enough. Sometimes you just know. Henry stood up, agitated. Bill, I'm your lawyer and your friend, and I have to advise you against this. Your nephew will contest it. He'll claim undue influence, diminished capacity. This will get ugly. Let it get ugly. I'm ready for a fight. Think about what you're doing. You're giving away millions of dollars worth of property to someone you just met. The courts will never see this as anything but coercion or confusion. Then we'll make sure the paperwork is airtight. We'll have doctors examine me right now if we need to. But this is happening, Henry. Today. Margaret's head was spinning. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen. Not to people like her. There has to be something else, she said. Some other reason. People don't just give away ranches. Bill was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. You want the truth? I'm tired. I'm tired of being alone in that big house. Tired of fighting with Raymond about selling. Tired of wondering if everything I built will be torn down the day I'm gone. Last night, lying there bleeding, I thought I was going to die. And the only thing I could think about was how sad it was that everything I'd worked for would end up in the hands of someone who didn't care about it. He paused, rubbing his face with his hands. Then I woke up and there you were. And I saw how you'd cared for me. How you'd stayed up all night with a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I saw your barn and your farm, and I could tell you were fighting the same fight I fought 40 years ago. Trying to hold on to something that matters even when the whole world seems set against you. That's not enough reason to give away everything you have, Margaret whispered. Maybe not for some people. But I don't have children. Ruth and I tried, but it never happened. So the question I've been asking myself is simple. What's the point of building something if it dies with you? What's the point of all those years of work if it just gets sold off to the highest bidder? He looked at her intently. You could have turned me away last night. You had every reason to, but you didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. And I'd rather bet on your character than my own blood. Henry sat back down heavily. Bill, even if I go along with this insanity, you know Raymond will fight. He'll drag this through every court in Montana. I know. That's why we're going to do this right. Every I dotted, every T crossed. Mrs. Hayes, are you willing to be examined by a doctor who will testify that you didn't coerce me or drug me or somehow manipulate me into this? Margaret nodded mutely. And Henry, you'll testify that I came to you of my own free will, that I was coherent and understood what I was doing. Bill. Henry's voice was pained. Will you testify to the truth, Henry? The lawyer closed his eyes and sighed. Yes. Against my better judgment, yes. Good, then let's get started. The next few hours passed in a blur. Henry drew up papers while Bill dictated terms. Margaret sat numbly, feeling like she was in a dream. A doctor was called in. He examined Bill, asked him questions, checked his pupils and his memory. Mild concussion, the doctor concluded. But he's lucid, knows who he is, where he is, what day it is. I'd recommend rest, but there's no sign of serious cognitive impairment. More papers, more signatures. Henry explained each document carefully, but Margaret barely heard him. Her hands shook as she signed her name over and over. There was one condition. Bill was clear about that. The land had to remain a working ranch. She could never sell it to developers or break it up. If she violated that term, the property would go to a land conservancy. I need to know it'll stay what it is, Bill said. That's all I ask. Finally, it was done. Henry notarized the last document and sat back, looking exhausted. Well, he said, I just witnessed the most unusual transaction of my career. Mrs. Hayes, you are now the owner of the Thornton Ranch, all 2,000 acres. Margaret looked down at the papers in her hands, the deed with her name on it. Margaret Hayes, owner. She started to cry. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something is too big to hold inside. Bill reached over and patted her hand. It's going to be all right. Better than all right. How can you be sure? She asked through her tears. Because I've been doing this for 40 years, and I know good soil when I see it. And you, Margaret Hayes, you're good soil. Outside the office, a car pulled up. A young man got out, moving fast and angry. Henry saw him through the window and went pale. That's Raymond. Bill smiled grimly. Right on time. Dorothy must have called him. The door burst open, and Raymond Thornton stood there, his face red with fury. What the hell is going on here? The real fight was about to begin. Raymond Thornton looked like he wanted to put his fist through a wall. He was about 35, tall and well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to fight for anything. Uncle Bill, what have you done? Bill stood up slowly, steady despite his injury. I've done what I should have done months ago. Dorothy called me, said you were here signing papers. Tell me it's not what I think it is. If you think I just deeded my ranch to Mrs. Hayes here, then you'd be right. Raymond's face went from red to purple. He turned to Margaret, and the look he gave her was pure poison. You. What did you do to him? How did you trick him into this? Margaret felt her own anger rising. She'd been pushed around enough in her life. I didn't trick anyone. I found your uncle bleeding in my barn during the storm and helped him, that's all. That's all? Raymond laughed, but there was no humor in it. You helped him, and 12 hours later he signs over everything to you? You expect anyone to believe that? It's the truth. The truth is you saw an opportunity and took it. Old man, head injury, no family around, must have seemed like Christmas came early. That's enough, Raymond. Bill's voice was cold. You will not speak to her that way. I'll speak however I want. You're giving away my inheritance to some gold-digging nobody. Your inheritance? Bill's voice rose. Last I checked, I'm still alive, and the ranch was never yours to begin with. Henry tried to intervene. Gentlemen, please. Let's all calm down and discuss this rationally. There's nothing to discuss, Raymond said. This is obviously invalid. He has a head injury, for God's sake. Any judge will see this for what it is. I've been examined by Dr. Phillips. I'm of sound mind. Every document is properly executed. You can contest it all you want, but you'll lose. Raymond's hands were shaking. Why? Why would you do this to me? I'm your brother's son, your only family. For the first time, Bill's expression softened slightly. You're right. You are family. And if you'd ever shown 1 ounce of respect for the ranch, for what it means, things might be different. But all you've ever seen is dollar signs. That's not fair. Isn't it? How many times have you asked me to sell? How many times have you brought developers to the ranch without my permission? You even had the nerve to tell me I was too old to know what's best for my own land. Raymond's jaw tightened. I was trying to help you. The ranch is too much for you to handle alone. Maybe it is, but at least Mrs. Hayes will try to keep it alive. You'd just sell it off and forget it ever existed. You're making a mistake, a huge mistake, and when she runs it into the ground in 6 months, don't come crying to me. If she fails, that's her burden to bear. But I don't think she will. She's got something you never had. Grit. Raymond grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned back one more time. I'm contesting this. I'll fight it with everything I have. You're going to regret this, Uncle Bill. Both of you are. The door slammed behind him, rattling the windows. The silence that followed felt heavy. Margaret sat down, her legs suddenly weak. This was real. This was actually happening. And now there was going to be a legal battle. I'm sorry you had to see that, Bill said quietly. He's right about one thing, Margaret said. I might run it into the ground. I don't know what I'm doing. You'll learn, and you won't be alone. Over the next few weeks, Raymond made good on his threat. He filed a lawsuit claiming Bill wasn't mentally competent when he signed the deed. The local newspaper got hold of the story, and suddenly everyone in 3 counties had an opinion about it. Some folks thought Margaret was a scheming woman who'd taken advantage of an injured old man. Others thought Bill was a romantic fool. The gossip was brutal. Margaret tried to focus on learning about the ranch. Bill, despite his nephew's lawsuit, moved into the guest house on the property and started teaching her everything: how to check the cattle, how to read the land, how to work with the ranch hands who'd been there for years. The foreman, a man named Carlos who'd worked for Bill for 20 years, was skeptical at first. Margaret could see it in his eyes. But she showed up every morning before dawn, ready to work. She didn't ask the hands to do anything she wouldn't do herself. Slowly, she earned their respect. The lawsuit moved forward. Raymond's lawyers dug into everything. They questioned Margaret's background, her finances, her character. They made her sound like a criminal. The deposition was the worst. Raymond's attorney was a sharp-dressed woman from the city who knew how to make every question sound like an accusation. Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true you were facing foreclosure on your property? Yes. And isn't it convenient that you met Mr. Thornton just when you needed money most? I didn't know who he was when I helped him. So you say, but you expect us to believe that you helped a total stranger out of pure kindness, and he just happened to give you 2,000 acres worth millions of dollars? I didn't expect anything. I just did what was right. How noble. Tell me, did you research Mr. Thornton's net worth before or after you helped him? Margaret felt her face flush. I never researched anything. I still don't know what the ranch is worth, and I don't care. The lawyer smiled like a cat with a mouse. You don't care about millions of dollars? I care about the land, about keeping it the way it should be. That's all. The questioning went on for hours. By the end, Margaret felt wrung out like an old dish rag. But then it was Bill's turn, and everything changed. He sat in that witness chair looking small and old, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. He talked about the night of the storm, about waking up to find Margaret keeping watch, about seeing in her the same determination his wife Ruth had possessed. My nephew thinks I'm senile, Bill said. He thinks I don't know what I'm doing. But I've never been more certain of anything. I built that ranch from nothing. I know what it takes, and Mrs. Hayes has it. Raymond's lawyer tried to rattle him. Mr. Thornton, you understand you're giving away your life's work to someone you'd known for less than a day? I understand perfectly. Don't you think that's irrational? I think it's the most rational thing I've ever done. I've spent 40 years building something that matters, and I'm making sure it goes to someone who'll treat it the way it deserves. Even though she has no experience running a ranch? Neither did I when I started. Experience can be learned, character can't. They brought in other witnesses. Carlos testified that Bill seemed sharp as ever, that he'd been talking about wanting to change his will for months. The ranch hands backed Margaret, saying she worked harder than anyone they'd ever seen. The diner owner in town testified that he'd overheard Raymond multiple times, complaining about Bill refusing to sell, calling the old man stubborn and foolish. A neighbor testified that Raymond had approached him about buying adjoining land, already acting like the ranch was his to sell. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret spent her days in court and her evenings at the ranch, learning everything she could. She was exhausted, scared, and more stressed than she'd ever been, but she also felt something else. Purpose. Finally, the day came for closing arguments. Raymond's lawyer painted Margaret as a manipulator who'd preyed on a vulnerable old man. Margaret's lawyer, a young man named Thomas who'd taken the case for almost nothing because he believed in it, painted a different picture. "This isn't about money," Thomas said. "It's about legacy. It's about a man who built something beautiful and wanted to make sure it survived him. Mr. Raymond Thornton sees property. Mr. William Thornton sees legacy. And Mrs. Hayes? She sees possibility." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to everything. She took 3 weeks to make her decision. Those 3 weeks were the longest of Margaret's life. She worked the ranch like it was already hers because in her heart it was. But the fear was always there. What if they took it away? Then the call came. The judge had made her ruling. Margaret drove to the courthouse with Bill beside her, both of them silent. This was it. Everything came down to what happened in the next hour. They walked into that courtroom not knowing if they'd walk out winners or losers. The judge looked at them both and began to speak. The courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to hear the verdict. Margaret could feel dozens of eyes on her back as she sat at the defendant's table. Judge Patricia Morrison looked down at the papers in front of her, her face unreadable. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "I've reviewed all the evidence in this case," the judge began. "The testimony, the medical reports, the depositions. This is, without question, one of the most unusual cases I've presided over in my 20 years on the bench." Raymond sat up straighter, a hint of a smile on his face. "The plaintiff argues that William Thornton was not of sound mind when he executed the deed transfer, that he was suffering from a head injury, and was unduly influenced by the defendant." Margaret felt Bill's hand find hers under the table. His grip was steady. "However," the judge continued, "the medical evidence shows clearly that Mr. Thornton was lucid and coherent. Dr. Phillips examined him thoroughly on the day in question. There is no evidence of cognitive impairment beyond a mild concussion, which did not affect his decision-making capacity." Raymond's smile faded. "Furthermore, I find the testimony of Mr. Carlos Mendoza particularly compelling. He stated that Mr. Thornton had expressed dissatisfaction with his nephew's intentions for the ranch for several months prior to the incident. This was not a sudden decision made in the heat of the moment, but rather the culmination of long consideration." The judge looked directly at Raymond. "Mr. Raymond Thornton, I understand your frustration. However, your uncle's property is his to dispose of as he sees fit. He is not obligated to leave it to you simply because you are family. The evidence shows he acted with full knowledge and understanding of his actions." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Therefore, I find in favor of the defendant. The deed transfer is valid and legally binding. Mrs. Margaret Hayes is the rightful owner of the Thornton Ranch." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Raymond stood up so fast his chair fell over. He looked at Bill with something like hatred in his eyes, then stormed out of the courtroom without a word. Margaret couldn't move. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, while people around her erupted in whispers and conversations. "We won," Bill said quietly beside her. "You won." "No," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "We won." The next few months were a whirlwind. Margaret threw herself into learning everything about the ranch. Bill was patient with her, teaching her how to read the weather, how to know when cattle were sick, how to manage the books and plan for different seasons. The ranch hands, who'd been watching her carefully, fully accepted her now. Carlos became not just a foreman but a friend, someone she could rely on when things got tough, and things did get tough. There were bad storms and sick cattle. There were broken fences and equipment failures. There were days when Margaret wanted to cry from exhaustion, but there were also sunrises over the grazing land that took her breath away. There were moments watching new calves take their first wobbly steps. There were evenings sitting on the porch with Bill, drinking coffee and talking about the day. Margaret kept her promise. She never once considered selling the land. Instead, she poured everything she had into making it thrive. She modernized some of the operations but kept the heart of what Bill had built. Her old farm, the one she'd nearly lost, she turned into something special. With the weight of debt finally lifted, she converted it into a rescue operation for horses that had been abused or neglected. It felt right somehow. She'd been rescued herself in a way. Now she could pass that gift forward. The community's opinion of her slowly changed. The people who'd thought she was a gold digger saw how hard she worked. They saw that she didn't live like a rich woman, didn't put on airs, didn't forget where she came from. Bill stayed in the guest house, happy to be near the land he loved, but no longer carrying the burden of running it alone. He and Margaret fell into an easy friendship. He was the father she'd lost young. She was the daughter he'd never had. 18 months after that stormy night, Margaret woke up at dawn as usual. She made coffee and walked out to check on the cattle in the eastern pasture. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of perfect fall day that made you glad to be alive. When she got back to the main house, Carlos was waiting on the porch. His face was grave. "It's Bill," he said quietly. Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her hand. They found him in his bed, looking peaceful. The doctor said it was his heart, quick and painless. He'd gone to sleep and simply hadn't woken up. Margaret sat beside him for a long time, holding his hand even though it was already cold. She cried for the man who'd changed her life, for the friend she'd lost, for the unfairness of having so little time with someone who'd meant so much. The funeral was 3 days later. The church was so packed, people stood along the walls and spilled out into the yard. Ranch hands and neighbors, business associates and old friends. They all came to say goodbye to Bill Thornton. Margaret had been asked to speak. She stood at the pulpit looking out at all those faces, and for a moment couldn't find her voice. Then she thought about what Bill would want her to say. "Bill Thornton was the kindest man I ever knew," she began. But his kindness wasn't the soft, easy kind. It was the hard kind. The kind that sees what needs to be done and does it even when it's difficult. She paused, gathering herself. "He gave me a gift I can never repay. Not just land or cattle or money. He gave me purpose. He showed me that one act of compassion can change everything. That doing the right thing, even when it's risky or scary, matters more than we know." Her voice grew stronger. "Bill spent 40 years building something that mattered, and in his wisdom he made sure it would outlive him. Not because he gave it to family, but because he gave it to someone who would love it the way he did, who would fight for it the way he did, who would see it not as property but as legacy." She looked at the casket covered in wildflowers from the ranch. "I promise you, Bill, I'll spend the rest of my life proving worthy of your trust. The ranch will stay wild and free and beautiful. It'll be what you always meant it to be. Not just a business, but a testament to what happens when someone refuses to give up on their dreams." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could see the land rolling out forever in all directions. Margaret stayed after everyone else had gone, sitting in the grass beside the fresh grave. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself. For taking a chance, for showing me that sometimes the biggest changes in life come from the smallest acts of kindness." The wind picked up, rustling through the grass, and for just a moment Margaret could swear she heard Bill's voice in it, telling her she was going to be just fine. 5 years later, Margaret stood in the same spot on the hill. The ranch was thriving. She'd expanded the cattle operation, brought in new breeding stock, and even started hosting young people from the city who wanted to learn about ranch life. She'd never remarried. The ranch was enough. The work was enough. The purpose was enough. Sometimes late at night she'd think back to that stormy evening when she'd found a wounded stranger in her barn. How close she'd come to walking away. How different her life would be if she had one decision. One act of compassion. That's all it took to change everything. Margaret had learned that kindness isn't just about making people feel good. Sometimes kindness is about seeing potential in someone and giving them a chance to rise to it. Bill had seen something in her that night, something she hadn't even seen in herself, and she'd spent every day since trying to be the person he'd believed she could be. The ranch would go on long after she was gone. She'd already made plans for it, ensuring it would pass to someone who would love it the way she and Bill had. The cycle would continue. As the sun set over the land, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Margaret smiled. This was what Bill had wanted. This was his legacy. And it was hers too. Sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest choices. Help someone who needs it. Be kind when you have every reason not to be. See people for who they could be, not just who they are. Bill Thornton had lived by those rules, and in the end, they'd created something that would last forever. Margaret walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, where lights were burning warm and welcoming in the windows. She had work to do tomorrow. Cattle to check, fences to mend, a legacy to honor, and she couldn't wait.